বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি।
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 14th June 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. A year after Galwan clash, China strengthening base along the LAC. Now it has been a year since the Galwan clash happened, that is clash between the Indian army and the Chinese army, where Indian army lost close to 40 of our soldiers, and China, though according to some conservative estimates, lost more than 50 people, but only acknowledged 4 so far. Now, according to the latest inputs that we are getting from the LAC, 3 things are happening. One, the Chinese have been rotating their troops, meaning old troops were being pulled back and new troops were being brought in. The second, they are building additional accommodations, both in the form of permanent structures and in temporary structures in multiple areas in the LAC. Now, Indian Army has also, or the intelligence as such, has also observed construction of field hospitals added with procurement of mobility vehicles that can be used in snowy conditions. Now, when you look at these actions taken by the Chinese army at the LAC, it is becoming indicative and clear at this point of time that both they are preparing for a long haul, meaning they have no intention of pulling back now, and they are thinking about permanently stationing their soldiers in these posts. So the question of de-induction or pulling back of troops doesn't come, because till now we had 11 levels of corp commander level talks with the Chinese, but the 11th one resulted in the disengagement at Pangong Lake area, but not de-induction. You have to remember that it is very specific in that way. Since then, the Chinese have refused to budge their positions and move back to April's status quo ante. Now, in addition to all of this that they have been doing, it has been observed that the China has intensified construction work behind the main confrontation points in Aksai Chin, and recently China has also conducted exercises in Tibet and opposite to Arunachal Pradesh. So one thing, at this point of time, they are in for the long haul. We have always been for the long haul because our troops are more acclimatized to the conditions, our troops are more prepared for these conditions. But when you talk about infrastructure being built, particularly at these flashpoints, it means that they have every intention to stay there. So when the question of de-induction or disengagement comes, it is going to be very hard, because that is what India has been asking for, and the Chinese are saying be happy with what you got. So this thing is going to be prolonged for at least foreseeable future, until and unless either it escalates into a blown out short term war, or completely de-escalates where people move back to their respective positions. But when you talk to experts and when you see the ground preparations that are being made by the Chinese, particularly, they have moved a lot of artillery, short range artillery, to the plateau heights of around 5,000 to 6,000 meters. So that becomes a problem when these people are militarizing the border, which was sparsely militarized earlier, but only surveilled, and that too sparsely. But now China is moving troops, China is moving mechanized divisions, China is moving short-term artillery, China is moving short-term defense equipment. So it becomes complicated if and when negotiations restart again and the concept of de-induction and disengagement come into the picture. So a lot of things are at play, but nonetheless we have to hope for a peaceful resolution. But those things are looking unlikely because there is currently a stalemate. Nobody is talking to anybody. Back channel negotiations, I'm sure, are going right now, but nothing is concrete until and unless some real-time changes do happen in the LAC area. Moving on to the next article, fight against authoritarianism, extremism, says Prime Minister at G7 meet. India was a guest to the G7 that was concluded in Corbis Bay, UK recently, and during his speech and his outreach session as a guest country, Prime Minister Narendra Modi reiterated that India is a natural ally to work with the G7 grouping or the countries of G7, which are the world's richest countries, in their fight against threats of authoritarianism. Along those lines, when he was speaking, he said that open societies and open economies are the key for overall growth of the world. Now, this is again reiterating that in a way we are indicating and expressing our interest that we are open for business. In addition to this, Mr. Modi has also called on tech companies and social media platforms to ensure a safe cyber environment for all. This statement is particularly significant because we know how the government of India and social media companies and digital media companies have been at loggerheads with each other regarding the new IT rules or IT guidelines that were brought in by the government of India. Now, as far as the readout from the Ministry of External Affairs is concerned, they are talking about the need for a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, and India is at this point of time considering the US President's proposal for Build Back Better World initiative that has been directly seen as a counter to China's One Belt, One Road initiative. But this Build Back Better World initiative will be more based on the principles of transparency and inclusion. So India is considering to join this initiative, but there are a lot of pitfalls when you get into these kinds of initiatives because these initiatives come at a cost for the poorer countries. Because when you look at the agreements that are made during these kinds of initiatives, they are always skewed towards richer countries, and at the end of the day, the poorer country gets nothing out of it. So we have to be very careful when we are getting into these kinds of agreements where our own development and our own self-interest are staked. As far as the outcomes of the G7 summit itself are concerned, they said that they are going to donate 1 billion vaccines to developing nations, and the G7 finally endorsed Biden's Build Back Better World initiative to counter China's Belt and Road initiative. They have also agreed to support the global minimum tax that was proposed by United States. Now, they have reiterated their stance that there should be a detailed inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, and the readout from this particular G7 meet itself was critical of China and Chinese actions. Moving on to the next article, the world is hardly wired for cyber resilience. Now, recently a string of high-profile cyber attacks have taken place in US and in other parts of the world, exposing the severe vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure even in advanced nations compared to the nations like India and other developing and underdeveloped countries. Particularly, let us look at the examples or the high-profile cyber attacks that took place on the shores of America during the past several months alone. In the end of 2020, a major cyber attack took place on the critical infrastructure or the critical official infrastructure of United States, meaning government infrastructure of United States was attacked by alleged Russian-sponsored hackers called SolarWinds. Now, this particular breach was very successful from the point of view of hackers because they were able to breach across several levels of or several wings of US government, including defense, energy and state, and they were able to steal large quantities of data from defense, energy and state departments of the US governments. In addition to that, that was 2020, and that hacking or that cyber attack was termed as SolarWinds, and that happened in the end of 2020, which was sponsored from or sponsored by Russia. Now that was the end of 2020. With the beginning of 2021, instead of the US government entities or US government assets, civilian groups or civilian assets were targeted by a Chinese group called Hafnium. When the Russians were cyber attacking US entities, they were specifically concentrating on US government assets. When the Chinese group was hacking the US companies, they were going for US organizations, particularly private organizations. This they were able to do by exploiting a serious flaw in Microsoft software, and were successfully able to gain remote control of the affected systems. And this Hafnium hack was also very successful in terms of various US organizations lost their data or got their data held for ransom by this Chinese group. Immediately after getting over this attack, US again witnessed a third major cyber attack. In this, the most critical infrastructure of the US was attacked. See, let us say the data, okay, defense, energy, state, okay, critical data has also been lost, but that didn't have an impact on the functioning of the day-to-day governance or any other aspect of the department itself. Yes, it was an inconvenience and a lot of data was compromised, but nonetheless it didn't compromise any asset in the field itself, meaning it didn't translate into a direct impact. Possibly there might have been certain knock-on effect as a result of those attacks, particularly the SolarWinds attack, but nonetheless we weren't made aware of it because of US secrecy. Now with this particular case of the recent one, where some hackers from Russia or East European countries attacked on Colonial Pipeline, which is a major supplier of oil to the US East Coast. So what happened in this particular attack was, the attackers were able to gain access to critical systems of this Colonial Pipeline company, and they were able to lock out them out of their own systems by inserting an ransomware, meaning these files were encrypted and the company couldn't access these files. And at the end of the day, the Colonial Pipeline had to pay several $1 million as a ransom to these hackers to unlock their computers and release their files. So what was the effect of it? The effect of it was so severe in US in particular states was such that people had to carry water bottles and water cans to fuel stations to get petrol, because the queue lines for the petrol stations was so long that people had to get out of their cars, walk to the fuel station, stand there again in a line for hours together and fill up their petrol cans or jerry cans. That was the impact on the East Coast, particularly during this cyber attack. As a result of the Colonial Pipeline attack, the company wasn't able to supply fuel to at least certain percent of East Coast for 2 to 3 days. So American economy runs on fuel at the end of the day. The percentage of car usage and everything is far higher than anywhere else. So when they lost a critical arm to their energy security, they were taken aback. This was the most successful in terms of the damage that was inflicted, and successful in terms of the amount of ransom that these hackers were able to get out of this Colonial Pipeline company from. Moving on, and this wasn't the end of the story there. Again, a Russian-backed group called Nobelium. I don't know where these people get their names, Hafnium, Nobelium. I think they should come up with new names, but nonetheless interesting names. But these are bad hacker groups who act at the behest of state assets or non-state actors against civilian assets, particularly in this case, right? So the Nobelium group launched again a phishing attack on 3,000 email accounts, particularly targeting US aid and several other organizations, and many other US subsidiary firms were held for ransom and again became target of ransomware, and these companies had to pay up millions of dollars in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to gain back control of their own systems. So everybody has a baseline understanding of how cybersecurity works, and everybody thinks, or it's a matter of fact, that US is far more advanced in terms of cybersecurity compared to India, right? Because of the advanced nature of its intelligence assets and technological assets, it is far more secure, or it is understood that it is far more secure. But this is where the danger lies in. While most countries have been concentrating on erecting cyber defenses to protect military and strategic targets, we forgot to deploy the same countermeasures in terms of cybersecurity or cyber warfare to civilian assets. Now, what we were worried about till now or till this point of time was the concept called zero-day attack, meaning that somebody would instill a software or some ransomware or virus would find itself into the critical systems of our defense or military installations, and it could cripple the entire system and could lie undetected for days or for a long period of time before it is found and neutralized and our assets are secured. If you remember the case of the Iranian enrichment program, we are not going into that, but remember the Stuxnet virus. It crippled the entire Iranian nuclear program for decades, or for at least years to come. That is what zero-day softwares or zero-day viruses or zero-day ransomwares are called. They get in, they stay there, they do all the damage that they can do, but nobody cannot find it for few days. When they are found, the damage is irreparable. That is what zero-day viruses or zero-day capabilities are called. And let us come to the picture of India. So before we get into understand how India is vulnerable to this, few years back there were few events that took place in Indian embassies around the world. So few years back, what happened was, what information that I have personally is that China hacked Indian embassies and systems in Indian embassies around the world 4 times. Not once, not twice, not thrice, 4 times. They were able to get into systems that are in Indian embassies around the world 4 times and stole our data. In one particular case, they were able to get or gain access of our computers, webcam and microphones, and were eavesdropping on our consulate staff's conversations. So that is the state of Indian IT infrastructure in embassies. Translate the same thing into Indian shore. But let me be clear here. Yes, we have certain securities in place. Yes, data is secure in certain installations and certain critical assets, but nonetheless, majority of the data is vulnerable. That is one of the reasons why these foreign companies refuse to give critical IT data or critical IP, intellectual property, to Indian companies or India as a whole. Whenever we talk about critical military infrastructure or new technologies in military that India is trying to procure, and when we go and ask them, can we have the technology, will you transfer the plans of this technology to us, these companies outrightly refuse, stating that if we give you the data, it's like us giving data directly to China. So, that is the issue here. We are also insecure. Our assets are also unsecure. And when you look at the countries that are being attacked by cyber thieves or cyber criminals, India is at least at the third or fourth place on the list, because we are the most affected of all the attacks that have taken place till now. Now experts are clearly saying that when some company is attacked in India, the recovery cost from the attack is going to be so huge that the company has to shut its door. So it no longer become economical to even keep accepting the attack ratio, right? It has to be equitable. At least some economical sense has to make. Now we are at a point, because of the number of attacks the number of attacks that are happening on Indian companies have reached to a certain level that the companies cannot operate if they pay the ransom. The companies cannot operate because they are attacked. So it's a double-edged sword that we are living in right now. Military ones, but the civilian ones also. You have to extend the same technologies to civilian companies, because they handle most of the data of Indian citizens and you have to secure them. Let me give you one example. Let us see that people are hearing the name Clubhouse for the last few months, right? Everybody is on Clubhouse. You have that, you have this in Clubhouse. But does anybody know where the data of the Clubhouse is stored in? According to one of my sources, majority of the data is stored on Chinese servers, including the American ones. So American data, Indian data is stored on Chinese servers. Don't you think the Chinese government is going to have some sort of an access to that data? So we don't have enough laws to secure our own data. Then what is the point of having a cybersecurity wing or having a cybersecurity ecosystem in India itself, right? You have to protect the data. You have to have laws so that these data is protected at any cost, which we don't have right now, because for some or the other reason the concept of data protection has missed us entirely. We said data protection छोड़ दो, हमको क्या होता है? We have to think about cybersecurity in terms of data protection, because it is no longer that you can send a group of soldiers or a platoon of soldiers and gain control of a territory. It has moved entirely online. Warfare, digital warfare or cyber warfare has indeed become the fifth and the critical domain of urban modern warfare. You no longer think in terms of army, air force, navy. You think in terms of multi-domain attacks, meaning your soldiers are attacking on the ground. Your IT experts or your IT wing of army or air force or military is working to penetrate the vulnerabilities of the enemy combatant or enemy country, and your digital assets are moving in as fast as your ground troops and securing your victory from all fronts. It has become a multi-domain warfare. It is no longer that you send your navies, you send your armies into the field. Backing them up, you are doing two things. You are securing your assets from your side and you are attacking assets of the enemy side too. It has become a really multi-domain warfare right now. And every time such cyber attacks happen, the first thing that comes to mind is what happens if a healthcare system is brought to its knees. What is preventing cyber criminals from attacking our healthcare data, Aadhaar data, or primary healthcare data that is stored on servers on national importance, right? This data is critical because if healthcare system crumbles, particularly during the pandemic times, the cost is going to be beyond imagination. So what is the solution for this right now? Particularly, let us concern ourselves to India. Forget about other countries. Concern about India first. So India doesn't have data protection laws. Bring in the data protection laws. You have your military assets secured. Extend the same principles to private companies. Engage with those private companies. Build a network of companies or build a network of systems that can protect your infrastructure and your civilian assets in a simultaneous way, and they can push back any live cyber attacks that might happen. 2. When you talk about protecting healthcare infrastructure, you have to talk about in terms of cyber security also. And now you have to, the third and the final, this is the most important system solution for whatever we are facing and we'll be facing in the future in more numbers. You have to create an environment where at every level of transmission the data is secured. So that is where the concept of zero trust based environment comes into picture. Zero trust means zero trust on endpoint devices, meaning whatever the data you are sending with the idea that it is not secure on the endpoint of that message. Zero trust on identity, zero trust on the network to protect all sensitive data. That is where the concept of protection at all times comes into play. Your data is protected at every point of time from multiple vectors of attack. And on top of that, you have to develop critical infrastructure using latest technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and quantum computing when you try to address the challenges of cybersecurity. Here is where the skewness comes into play. Countries like European Union countries, UK, US have far more advanced quantum computing capabilities and machine learning capabilities. Countries such as India are far lagging behind in terms of these technologies, but we are playing catch up right now to China and US. We are somewhere in the bottom of the rung in terms of quantum computing technologies and machine learning capabilities. We have to increase our understanding, we have to increase our spending into this area so that we can secure our future in the digital domain. Moving on to the next article, planning for a biosecure future. Now, one of the things that this pandemic has shown us is the concept of biosecurity. So the traditional study of national security has been that we have to look in terms of nuclear warfare. That has been the most critical aspect of our social security or national security studies. How the other country, how the enemy country, or how a rogue state is going to use nuclear capable missiles or nuclear material against our own security. But with the pandemic, what we were introduced, or at least the correct word here to use is reintroduced, is the concept of biosecurity. Now, because of this pandemic, future of national security will be forced to undergo a paradigm shift, because we have to consider or rethink the sources of insecurity. So our source of insecurity has been nuclear warfare. Now, not only nuclear warfare is a real potential threat to India or any other country, the concept of biosecurity or biothreat is also that real. Both are equal. Till now we have been only concentrating on nuclear threats. Now we have to concentrate on biological threats also. Why should we consider about biosecurity or biothreats? Because there has been an exponential growth in technologies such as synthetic biology. People can create whatever they want using artificial intelligence and nanotechnology in a biological lab. That is called synthetic biology. And when it comes to this particular branch of biology, people are playing fast and loose with these things. Remember a few days back when we were talking about the BS4 certification of the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab? What was the problem there? The staff were unprepared, the staff were undertrained, they were understaffed, they didn't follow proper protocols, and they crossed the ethical bounds of the BTC agreement. Whatever the research that they were doing was unethical to begin with, and it was against the BTC agreement that we signed in year 1994, I think. What is stopping a rogue country or a rogue organization or a terror organization using all these technologies to create a synthetic biological warfare weapon, virus? And it isn't going to go away anytime soon, because the concept of synthetic biology, or the branch of synthetic biology, in the last 2 decades alone had grown leaps and bounds, and people don't understand what is the impact of this growth completely. Neither are there security studies that were being conducted. Yes, US and other countries are doing it, but India is not in the league of that discussion. I'm not disparaging India, but you have to understand that when we have so many issues to cover, this becomes one more issue that India cannot afford to concentrate on. It becomes a simple concept of economics and scale. Now, this biosecurity concept has been pushed into our faces by the lab leak theory of Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, what is synthetic biology? Synthetic biology is a revolutionary technology that can help us manipulate biological organisms and processes for human betterment, particularly in the fields of treating diseases, re-engineering damaged cells, and this is where the issue comes, and synthetic biology becomes a double-edged sword. Either way, you are going to cut yourself. So, now we have to concentrate on having a credible and an effective surveillance program in place to focus on threats emanating from biological sources. This applies to all countries, not only India, especially India, because we are vulnerable to it. So, there is a reality at this point of time that very little focus is being given to threats emanating from biological sources. Now we have to do the exact opposite and give the most focus to this, like how much we are giving to nuclear threats, nuclear agreements, nuclear treaties that are in place. We have to come up with updated treaties, upgraded protocols, upgraded alliances with other countries to surveil and curtail emanating biological threats and national security vulnerabilities. Particularly now, let us understand the Indian situation. There is a lot of discrepancies as to who has control of it, because two different ministries look into two different aspects of the biological aspect of this particular issue. When compared to other countries, we are very poor at disease surveillance. Not that poor, but not enough. More can be done here. There is a lot of mismatch in coordination between various governments dealing with biosecurity issues. So the healthcare system is also not up to the standard to counter such biological security issues. So we need to better our advantage. We have to turn our disadvantaged position into an advantaged position. And we have to at least strive to prevent such pandemics happening in the future. So it has to be an overall. You have to surveil diseases. You have to coordinate with your own intergovernment organizations, with private companies. It has to be an overall engagement of the ecosystem itself. That is the biological research ecosystem. And now you have to simultaneously, in parallel with whatever the actions you are taking, must develop or augment your own healthcare system to meet future needs. Moving on to the next article, Biden's Manichaean vision. So Manichaean or Manichaeism is an old religion that breaks everything into simple things, good or evil. It's simple. It doesn't talk about any other thing. Anything you take according to this Manichaeism, it talks about duality, meaning whether it is good or evil. If you are a Manichaean, you are going to see things in black and white. Either it is good, either it is bad. It is good or evil. So simplifies everything but complicates it at the same time, because you cannot break everything into two simple things, good or evil. There is a midway. That is what happens when countries come into play. So let us understand what is the problem here. So the current president of United States, who has his political origins during the heights of Cold War, carries the same memories of the Cold War to the modern world. He carries this Manichaean vision that he inculcated during the Cold War politics of America to the modern politics of modern world. Now this is where the disparities or the dichotomy comes into play. Mr. Biden's vision is that the world is at an inflection point, and his point of view is that the world is divided into two ways. One is an autocratic way, which most people are supporting, that it is the best way to move forward because it is easy, it is efficient. And the second thing is the democratical way. Now, his perspective begins there. His foreign policy, when you look at it from a pragmatic point of view, his entire foreign policy is a reclaim at the stake that autocrats are bad, democracy should win at every point of time, it should be a democratic way of lifestyle, not a dictatorship and autocratic way of lifestyle. This concept that democracy should win over autocracy is the basis for Biden's foreign policy. That is what the author of this article is suggesting here. Now, when you look at this and translate it into his foreign policy actions, it makes a lot of sense, right? When you look at how Mr. Biden's foreign policy has been acting up, his messaging about team building by democracies went across the G7 meeting also, because this is where the thing entirely translated into a real thing, because G7 is a team of 7 countries, 7 democracies, 7 thriving democracies, which invited 4 other democracies, particularly Australia, India, South Africa and South Korea. Now, his idea that democracy should lead the way forward in the world order, his perspective is that the democracy should lead the way forward in the new world order. But the problem comes here because there is a lot of duality in the world right now. In the old Cold War era, things were pretty clear. You have the Russian bloc and you have the US-American bloc. So the idea for the Cold War was all the US or all the democracies in the world would unite and help US in beating Russia back. That was a Cold War era politic tactic. But look at modern times. It is no longer the USSR or the Russia world. It is a multipolar world. The power structure in the world itself has changed so much that the concept of grouping of all the democracies will help or will set the old order again straight, because there are a lot of complexities and the power is no longer concentrated in the hands of few. It is a mixture of countries sharing their own strengths with the world. Particularly, you have power centers in US, you have power centers in Europe, you have power centers in India, you have power centers in China, and you have a power center in Russia. At any day, at any point of time, Russia is a formidable force. You cannot discount Russia, despite how their economy is doing, how their infrastructure is doing. You cannot discount Russia. So, this Manichaean view doesn't translate well into modern politics. Now, there is this concept that Mr. Biden is promoting called the D10 coalition, meaning it would be a combination of G7 and the first invitees of the G7 meet, that is Australia, India and South Korea. That would make D10, which would make it democracies of coalition. Now the problem comes to the duality of the current world right in. So the D10 would be to bridge European and regional, that is Asian region approaches to Chinese challenges. You have Japan as an ally in G7, but with the addition of South Korea and India, it would augment their own strength to counter Chinese in the region itself. But despite this, the duality of the issue starts here, right? South Korea is still dependent on China for majority of its trade because its economy is deeply interwoven with that of the Chinese. Now, if South Korea joins D10, there is going to be a certain rupture of relations between China and South Korea. That is where this duality, this black and white thing falls apart. So whenever we are talking about a coalition of democracies, it has to transcend into the modern times where you have to engage with both sides of the aisle. Let us look at the example of India itself. If India joins D10, it cannot forget its relations with Russia, Iran and other authoritarian countries, particularly Myanmar, which is ever likely looking that that junta is going to be in power for longer than everybody is expecting it to be. And look at the case of America itself. America's entire Middle East and Middle East partners are autocratic. So it's no longer a black and white world. It's a multicolor world and a multipolar world. So your relationships or your groupings should match the times of present, and they should function as a unit, not as a separate entity. That is only when the D10, if and when it materializes, will certainly help the world to move towards a democratic process way. And it's a welcome sign for India. Moving on to the next article, no greater risk to children from anticipated third wave according to a report. Now, a report titled The Lancet COVID-19 Commission India Task Force, which consists of pediatricians and experts across the country, comprising clinics, top government medical colleges, large private and charitable hospitals, came out with a study indicating that they haven't found enough evidence so far to conclude that children are going to face a greater risk of infection or at a greater danger from COVID-19 infection from an anticipated third wave. One of the biggest worries with third wave is that the fears that it is going to infect children. Now, according to this study, according to the data that they collected, it seems that there is no greater risk to children from the anticipated third wave. Moving on to the next article, Prime Minister seeks support on patent waiver. So this is in lines with the G7 meet itself. During his talk, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, or during his speech, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has sought strong support from G7 countries to join the Indo-South African proposal for TRIPS waiver for coronavirus related medicines and vaccines. According to the Minister of External Affairs Ministry, though G7 countries supported text-based negotiations on TRIPS waiver proposal, till now European Union is yet to endorse it. The only country from the European Union that is endorsing this particular deal that was proposed by South Africa and India is President Macron, France, because he said that there is also as he highlighted the need to focus on ramping up production capacity in Africa and called on India to lend its expertise as an important production hub globally. Remember, Angela Merkel was very vocal about dismissing this particular TRIPS waiver, stating that they cannot allow this to happen, and they are regretting the fact that we have allowed India to become a vaccine hub and why we are dependent on India for vaccines. So it is going to be a long and path fraught with many obstacles for this TRIPS waiver to come into reality. Moving on to the next article, rare earth metals at the heart of China-US rivalry. Currently, China dominates rare earth metals market because rare earth metals are key for manufacturing. And when at a time US and Europe are thinking about shifting their manufacturing bases back to their own shores, they have to be still wary of where their raw materials are coming from. And currently China is the largest exporter of and importer at the same time of rare earth metals, and now they are threatening that they are going to cut off US and Europe from accessing to rare earth metals, which are essential for electric vehicles and other technologies. Now, the heavy dependence comes because US almost imports 90% of its rare earth metals from China, and European Union gets almost 98% of its supply from China. So 80% from the US, 98% from European, and shows that how vulnerable they are to Chinese supply chains. That is why recently US said that they are going to fund 170 billion or something like that into their own companies so that they build their research and other things and build their own resilient supply chains. But the reality of the matter is China is expected to remain dominant for some time to come, and the only way that they could achieve some sort of equal balance in this raw materials market is way of recycling and finding new sources for raw materials. But from the looks of it, China controls rare earth metal markets, which are critical in technologies that US and European Union are developing. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা। বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি।